Hello, everyone. Olá, boa tarde a todos. Okay, we are going to get started. It is a great pleasure to be here today. Welcome, everyone, to the IDB Invest Sustainability Week of 2024. My name is Bernardo Becker Fontana. I'm a legal and compliance officer with IDB Invest, and I'm connecting with you from Washington, D.C. This afternoon. For those of you that need translation, translation is on. You have translation available for the three languages: Portuguese, English, and Spanish. So make sure to click on that little globe button at the bottom of the screen, and you can activate the translation that you need. For those of you that don't know us, IDB Invest is an international development bank, which is part of the IDB group and is focused on development through the private sector. And for us, Sustainability Week this year is what we're calling the most consequential sustainability event for the private sector in Latin America and the Caribbean. We are tackling the most pressing challenges and issues when it comes to development in the private sector, including obviously environmental, social, and governance issues. This year, our event is taking place in the beautiful city of Manaus, in the heart of the Amazon. And it's such a great pleasure for us to be hosting our event in Brazil this year. The in-person event starts tomorrow, and today is the virtual day of the event. For those of you that attended our panels this morning, we had some amazing sessions. And now the topic of our panel is anti-bribery and anti-corruption compliance programs, particularly for small and medium-sized companies. It is part of governance, part of the G in ESG, but I would dare to say that it can be so important that it almost deserves its own letter, so to say. It deserves treatment of its own, particularly because the risks involved can be so damaging, not only legal and regulatory risks, but also the reputational risks for a company. And one of the difficulties that we face is that although there is a lot written and spoken and publicized about compliance programs, most of what's out there is focused on large companies or multinationals even. But what about small and medium-sized companies, as we call SMEs? SMEs represent about 90% of businesses worldwide, and in Latin America and the Caribbean, and that number is over 99%, where they generate more than 60% of formal employment. More often than not, many of these companies don't have the same level of resource availability that large corporations do. So when we're talking about anti-corruption compliance for those types of companies, what is it that is different? For us at IDB Invest, these are very important topics and these are very important questions. I will be moderating today's discussion, and in order to address some of these issues with us today, we have put together a truly amazing panel. I'm going to share the screen again here very quickly so you can see the names of all our amazing panelists. So we have with us today Hui Chen, who is known internationally as a leader in the field of ethics and compliance. She advises companies and enforcement agencies around the world in the design, implementation, and assessment of compliance programs. She was the first ever compliance counsel expert with the United States Department of Justice, where her job was to advise prosecutors when evaluating compliance programs of companies, including in anti-corruption. Hui is the author of a well-known document issued by the US DOJ called Evaluation of Corporate Compliance, which is one of the most important guidance for evaluating compliance programs in the world. We also have with us today Christine Köhler-Ganzenmüller, joining us from Brazil. Christine is the Director of Private Sector Integrity at the Controladoria Geral da União, the General Controller's Office in Brazil, where she's responsible for assessing the compliance programs of private companies, both on the enforcement side and in the context of CGU's advocacy initiatives. She has been in CGU for almost 20 years as a federal auditor And among other positions, he served also as the head of the coordination and negotiation and monitoring of leniency of self-disclosure agreements with companies in the context of CGU's enforcement activities. And last, but certainly not least, my dear colleague, Maria del Consuelo Naranjo Martinez. Maria is the head of private sector integrity in the IDB Group's Office for Institutional Integrity, what we call OII. Maria is a lawyer with extensive experience in anti-corruption matters, having worked with some of the most prominent law firms in Ecuador and Spain. As part of her job at the IDB Group, Maria is responsible for leading the team that assesses integrity risks, including corruption and fraud risks, in projects financed by IDB Invest and IDB Lab in the private sector. So our session will be bilingual. We'll embrace the diversity of our region and celebrate the fact that this year's conference is happening in Brazil, in Manaus. So you will hear me switching between English and Portuguese, and you can choose the translation, as I mentioned, accordingly. I also wanted to mention that the chat for questions is going to be open. So without further ado, let's start with our first questions and interactions with our panelists. And I want to start now with you, Hui. So Hui, we keep talking about compliance programs. The topic is not new, and we certainly gonna keep talking in the future also about the importance of compliance programs. So why is it that the topic has been so relevant, is relevant, and certainly is going to keep being relevant in the foreseeable future? Why does it matter so much for the private sector? And speaking specifically about small and medium enterprises, from a value proposition standpoint, why should they care about anti-corruption compliance? And what's the risk of them not doing so? Perhaps we start there.
Well, that's quite a lot to start with. So thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. I so wish I was actually in Manaus. I had the pleasure of visiting there in the Amazonas probably almost 10 years ago now, and I will never forget how beautiful it is there. And so I'm there with you in spirit. I'm joining with you, though, physically from San Francisco today. So I think I want to go back to what you said at the beginning, Bernardo. It's really very closely tied to the G of the ESG, of the governance piece. And no matter how the governance piece has been defined in the ESG world, to me, it comes down to a very simple concept, which is how well do you run your company? How disciplined do you run your company? And so much of the compliance system, the pieces that go into compliance, it's about bringing discipline to how you run your company, knowing who you're doing business with, knowing where your money is going, knowing who is doing what. And I think those are fundamental questions that anybody who wants to run a sound business wants to accomplish. Is that you don't want to run a company that you say, I don't really know who I'm doing business with. I don't know if I'm making a profit. I don't know where my money has gone. Those are not good business situations to find yourself in. So really, at the core, compliance systems is not so much about complying and following the laws. That's the end result. But that's one of the end results. But how you get there is by running a company with strong discipline and strong visibility and transparency into knowing that what your business is up to, how is it run. The value proposition here, so one, it's that. I mean, is really just running your company better. Two, of course, is the reputational aspect, that you don't want to be known as a company that makes your success by bribery. You also don't want to be known as the company that doesn't know what it's doing. And so at the end of the day, it comes back to the reputation that you have as a business. Now, I think this is particularly important for SMEs because SMEs really don't have the big muscles of the larger companies. So you are in a space where you have a lot of competition with each other. And when you have competition with each other, and if everybody tries to do business in a way that is reliant on bribery, you're essentially constantly outbidding each other. It's actually the worst business proposition ever. You can win this deal by a bribe today, but somebody else will outbid you the next time. And this is not a sustainable way to run a business. So the value proposition also for SMEs is larger company, because they have so much muscle and so much sort of capital reserve and so much sort of room to make mistakes, they sometimes can afford to run their companies not so efficiently. And many of us who have dealt with large companies know that sometimes it's not the stories of efficiency. But if you're a SME, you don't have the luxury of running things inefficiently. You need that discipline, that transparency, that knowing what is going on, knowing every dollar of mine, every currency of mine is going to work for the purpose that is consistent with my business. And so I think those are really the key value propositions in my mind.
That's super helpful. Thank you so much, Wei. I'm taking a lot of notes. I hope people are taking a lot of notes as well. A couple of things that really stuck in my mind that you said: bringing discipline, following the law as a result, which is super interesting, obvious, but very interesting, and sometimes not very self-evident. The reputational aspect of it, and the outbidding, the piece that you mentioned about profits in the short term, but no profits in the long term, which I think connect to the bigger issue of sustainability, right? Which we're talking about here in this conference. I want to turn now to Cristine. Cristine, a CGU é órgão do governo federal brasileiro, é um ente regulador. O que, óbvio, me faz pensar na parte de disciplina que a Rui mencionou, mas de uma outra forma, obviamente, do ponto de vista do órgão regulador. A CGU trabalha tanto na persecução de casos de corrupção envolvendo entes privados e públicos, como também na promoção de integridade do setor privado. Então, explica para a gente por que é que a integridade, compliance, cumprimento no setor privado é importante para a CGU. Se eu tenho uma empresa atuando no Brasil, de que maneiras é que a CGU leva em conta o meu programa de integridade na atuação do regulador, do ente regulador?
Olá, boa tarde a todas e todos. Obrigada, Bernardo, obrigada pela oportunidade. Falando um pouquinho sobre integridade, esse assunto de tanta relevância, a CGU vem desenvolvendo ao longo dos anos, especialmente após o advento da lei anticorrupção, diversas iniciativas e estudos sobre integridade. Cientes da importância do papel da CGU sobre a conscientização de integridade no âmbito empresarial. Então, nós temos linhas de atuação, como o Bernardo mencionou, de papel de combate à corrupção. Então, nós temos processos de responsabilização quando a empresa se envolve em atos ilícitos, em irregularidades, e nós temos também um papel de fomentar e promover a integridade no âmbito do setor empresarial. Dentre as medidas e iniciativas de fomento à integridade, eu gostaria de trazer aqui um pouquinho para vocês sobre o Pacto Brasil pela Integridade Empresarial e sobre o Programa Proética. O Pacto Brasil é um convite a todos os empresários, a todas as instituições privadas a assumirem um compromisso com a ética e com a integridade. A CGU desenvolveu essa iniciativa aberta a todas as empresas interessadas que venham a aderir, assumindo esse compromisso com a integridade. A CGU disponibiliza, através dessa adesão, uma ferramenta de autoavaliação. Nessa ferramenta, a empresa pode verificar as medidas mínimas de integridade indicadas como um patamar de programa de integridade. E através dessa ferramenta de autoavaliação, a empresa tem a possibilidade de identificar em qual estágio se encontra naquela que estamos chamando de jornada para a integridade, o pacto pela integridade. Porque a CGU possui ali, nessa ferramenta, disponibilizou as medidas consideradas medidas mínimas para o programa de integridade e, através de um papel indutor, identifica e induz as medidas ideais no crescimento desse programa de integridade. O Pacto Brasil é uma iniciativa gratuita para todo e qualquer interessado, todo e qualquer tamanho de empresa, e aí nós temos uma oportunidade para as empresas de menor porte, inclusive, que muitas vezes não possuem um programa robusto de integridade, mas o Pacto Brasil ele engloba também a possibilidade de empresas menores, com medidas mínimas, já assumirem e estabelecerem aquele programa de integridade. Então, nós dizemos que o Pacto Brasil ele pode ser considerado uma medida inicial ou uma iniciativa inicial de todos os interessados a despertar para a importância da integridade, a despertar para justamente implementar e tornar eficiente essas medidas de transparência, de engajamento da alta administração, de apoio da alta administração, de um canal de denúncia, de um código de ética, e inclusive para dizer que um programa de integridade ele pode ter medidas que não necessariamente são complexas, mas que justamente trazem um referenciamento para a empresa, para quem trabalha na empresa e para o mercado, sobre o comprometimento daquela empresa com a integridade privada. A empresa vai receber um selo, uma marca de signatária do Pacto Brasil, e com isso ela ganha, tem esse ganho reputacional e esse ganho de imagem, no sentido de assumir esse compromisso com a integridade. Então, falei do programa Pacto Brasil pela Integridade Empresarial. E aí, num segundo patamar, nós temos o programa Proética, que foi desenvolvido pela CGU há alguns anos, e que nós traduzimos já num nível de excelência de um programa de integridade. Então, o Proética, ele premia as empresas através de todo um processo de avaliação que a CGU faz, as empresas se habilitam, se candidatam, demonstram o seu programa de integridade, demonstram através de evidências qual o nível e quais as medidas que foram de fato implementadas, e a CGU, ao final do processo de avaliação, ela faz e premia essas empresas. Nós temos um dia de celebração, a empresa recebe o selo de empresa proética, então ela tem como referência o seu programa de integridade, então ele é considerado já num patamar de nível de excelência. Falando um pouquinho sobre o Proética, a nossa ideia é que aos poucos nós vamos trazer já medidas para além de compliance, medidas anticorrupção, nós estamos também tratando de medidas ambientais e de responsabilidade social. E agora falando, esse papel que eu mencionei, essas duas iniciativas foram relacionadas a ideias e iniciativas de fomento à integridade empresarial. Mas a CGU tem também o seu papel sancionador. E aí vem também a importância para as empresas que possuem programa de integridade estabelecido, aí sim, dentro de um nível de exigência diferenciado, mas a própria lei anticorrupção reconheceu e trouxe a importância do programa de integridade, ou seja, a empresa precisa ter um programa de integridade estabelecido, com medidas implementadas. Isso é feito durante um processo de responsabilização de uma empresa. Essas medidas são analisadas e podem redundar na atenuação da multa a ser aplicada ao final do processo de responsabilização. Novamente, vai existir toda uma avaliação, um processo de avaliação sobre essas medidas de integridade, e a depender do nível das medidas implementadas, a empresa pode receber de 0 a 5% de desconto, né, dentro do cálculo que é realizado para multa administrativa, a empresa recebe essa atenuante e esse redutor de multa. No âmbito dos acordos de leniência, da mesma forma, a lei e o decreto regulamentador da lei, esses dois regulamentos, eles trazem a importância do programa de integridade instituído e no âmbito do acordo de leniência, da mesma maneira, durante o processo de negociação, existe uma avaliação e uma discussão sobre o programa de integridade, e a depender da verificação e da solidez desse programa de integridade, pode também acontecer a redução da multa que é aplicada no âmbito do acordo de leniência. Além disso, no acordo de leniência, é importante a gente lembrar que existe um clausulado, denominado assim, clausulado sobre o programa de integridade. Então, existe um processo no qual a CGU faz a verificação e a avaliação e induz e determina que a empresa se comprometa com a melhoria o aperfeiçoamento daquele programa de integridade, ou até mesmo da instituição de medidas inexistentes até o momento. Então, tudo isso para dizer sobre a importância de programa de integridade, sobre a importância da integridade no âmbito empresarial. Eu acredito, Bernardo, que era mais ou menos isso a ideia, e fico à disposição.
Isso mesmo. Muito obrigado, Cristine. Você mencionou alguns elementos super importantes e quero saber mais da autoavaliação. A gente vai ter oportunidade para voltar disso. E você também mencionou alguns elementos, algumas dicas já que eu considero dicas quase práticas em relação a quais elementos um programa de compliance deve ter. Mas antes de chegar lá, vamos passar para Maria. Maria, now going back to English here. So Hui provided us with this broad, worldwide, I would say, view, which is super important, that is applicable to most jurisdictions, I would say. And Cristine told us a little bit about the point of view of a regulator in Brazil, right? So now, what about the multilateral development banks? IDB and IDB Invest are international organizations. We're owned by member countries. What is the importance of anti-corruption and compliance for us at the IDB group, and particularly for IDB Invest when it comes to working with the private sector in Latin America and the Caribbean?
Thank you so much, Bernardo, and good afternoon, everybody. I support what Wishen was saying. I wish I can be there in the Amazon. It's one of the most beautiful places that I've been in the world, if not the most. So fortunately, the ones that are there, and I'm very happy to be sharing these important topics for the IDB group. I will to answer your question, and thank you, because it's really relevant for the work that we do as multilateral development bank. So the IDB group, it places a special emphasis on anti-corruption and compliance in their finances activities. Especially, I will say, when we are talking about the private sector, in the side of the office that I work, which is supporting the private sector review with the due diligence. The IDB has established this office, which is the Office of Institutional Integrity, which is an independent office, which is in charge of investigating and preventing prohibited practices in the IDB group finance activities. We work closely with the bank departments and the IDB Invest to manage integrity risks. Why I bring this important role that we have here is because for the values that we share, we have fundamental values which are preventing prohibited practice in the finance activities that we have. Anti-corruption and compliance are fundamental for this IDB group mission. They ensure, for example, that our operations can be transparent, ethical, and that we can be accountable for where the money is going. We also acknowledge that the prohibited practice, such as corruption, fraud, and other misconducts, can have an impact on the development goals of the IDB. If we maintain these ethical or these principles, we foster a business environment that promotes sustainable and development practices. And this, of course, as we all know and could agree, that corruption undermines the trust, wasted resources that could go to a better purpose, and hampers the development efforts that we are trying hard. Not leaving aside also the reputational impact that these misconducts can have on the bank finance activities. That's why for the IDB, and especially when we are talking about the IDB Invest, in this case, finance activity, the private sector in engagement in our region, supporting a strong anti-corruption and compliance standards is crucial. As we all can agree, the region faces challenges, and having robust and compliance programs could help to mitigate these risks. And that's part of what we do from the review when we are investing or supporting a financing, is if we are able to mitigate potential risks due to the operation or the type of entity that we are facing through potential good practices, a robust compliance program, a culture of compliance in the entity that we are financing. I will say, going now to your question on the role of a compliance program for an SME, I will say that it will support this trust and the credibility on our partner. For an SME that are clients of IDB Invest, having a compliance program, I will say compliance practices. We don't necessarily need to talk about this complex program, and we will get into that in a minute. It demonstrates to commitment to the practices that I was saying before. If we can show that a company, independently of the size, but now we are talking about an SME, shares the same values that we are sharing, that we are trying to promote, it shows that their commitment to ethical business practices and help us to trust this partner, which in consequence, it helped them, the company, to have investors and to bring for us also other investors that we can say we rely in this counterparty. Therefore, I will flag the importance of trust that having a compliance practice brings, and help us on an important tool that is risk management. We don't expect not seeing risks in their operation, but what we expect is seeing a company that can handle those risks and that have the ability to respond accordingly to the practices that are being promoted. So in summary, just to some close remarks on this, the anti-corruption and compliance are critical for the IDB Group mission and to overall the development of the region that we are promoting. And from the IDB Invest side is something that we give a strong value at the moment that we are evaluating a counterparty. We will get more on how we do that. Thank you.
Perfect, Maria. Thank you so much. And for those of you that are not familiar with the concept of prohibited practices is a concept that is uniform throughout the largest development banks around the world, so the World Bank, us, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and other banks. They have all these definitions of prohibited practices, which are like fraud, corruption, collusion, obstruction, etc., all uniform throughout our framework. But so having heard the three of you, it is fair to conclude that this topic matters, I think, and hopefully we're able to convince those of you in the audience that were not yet convinced that they should be thinking about these issues. Now I'd like to get into some more practical advice. We have established that having or setting up an anti-corruption compliance program is important, but what exactly do we mean by that, and how should companies do it? I think Maria already mentioned something important, which is it doesn't necessarily have to be complicated. And with that, I want to turn to Hui. Going back to the description of the session, Hui, one size does not fit all. So what are the main elements of a compliance program, and what is different when it comes to SMEs? Companies might have resource limitations, as we mentioned. They might have to make choices as to where to focus their efforts. So if I'm an owner or a manager in a small or medium-sized company, where should I focus? And also, very important, how much does it cost?
Well, good questions. So I think I'm a strong proponent that one size does not fit all. So let's start by thinking about just what the traditional concept of what a anti-bribery and corruption program should look like, right? What are some of the basic elements? So very typically, and you would hear the different numbers. So there are some people who talk about 7 elements, 8 elements, 10 elements. They're roughly, I have actually mapped them out at one point. So they're all roughly the same set of mechanisms that we can run through here. So we typically, one of the first things people mention is having policies and procedures. So this is having a set of written standards that the company, the entire company, no matter how big or small, should abide by. They should be doing certain things always the same way. Those ways of doing things should be documented in some way in written policies and procedures. So that's element one. The other element that's often talked about is having designated resources. So having someone being accountable to make sure that there is a program, that there is policy, there are policies and procedures, that policy and procedures are followed. They're written well, they're communicated to the people. So all the people that are supposed to be accountable for these things happening. So whether that's a designated compliance officer or a compliance committee and compliance budget, all the dedicated resources to make sure that there is a program and to monitor this program to make sure it's working. Another common element is training and communications. So you have policies and procedures, but how do people know about them? You have certain ways of doing things. How do you equip people to know this is the way you do this thing in your company? So it just even, down to practical problem solving type of training and communications. So when your customers ask you to do something inappropriate, how do you respond? So all of those things about making sure your policies and procedures are practiced in your company and that your employees and your vendors know and understand what your expectations are. So training and communications. The other aspect is in monitoring and auditing. So that's basically the idea that when you have policies and procedures and you have trained your people on it, then you need to do something to make sure that all this is working, that people are doing what they're supposed to do. So these are internal audits, compliance inspections, and anything that you can do to just sort of either systematically or at least spot check to see that things are working. The other is internal investigation and disciplinary framework. So these are so we're sort of starting with you policy and procedures. You articulate your expectations and standards. You have people who are accountable to implement them, and you have resources dedicated to making sure it works. You train and you communicate. You start spot checking or system checking, and then you find sometimes that there are problems. And when you do find there are problems, how do you handle them? This is the investigation, the internal investigation and disciplinary piece. How do you make sure that you are alerted of the problems? How do you handle those problems? Another either separate or part of this element could be some kind of internal reporting. So commonly known as a hotline mechanism. So when people in the organization or outside of the organization see something wrong, who do they tell? How do they tell you? And then how do you respond to it? And when you actually find out who is responsible for the wrongdoing, what do you do with them? So those are sort of the common elements of the compliance programs. Now, what I didn't mention that really is the base of all of this is risk assessment. because risk assessment, which is understanding how much risk exposure you have as a business to this particular type of risk, anti-bribery and corruption, really dictates how you should be building this program. So let's get, policy and procedures as an example. If you have a 50,000 person company versus a 5-person company, I would expect that your policies and procedures would look very different. 5 people communicate very differently than 50,000 people. 50,000 people likely are not on the same location. They might not even speak the same language. They do different jobs. They don't know each other. So your policies and procedure in that instance, I expect to be a little more complicated because you have more people to communicate to. And you have more people in different functions that you have to make them understand how is this policy relevant to their job. But if you have 5 people, I mean, I don't know. I know a lot of families that are bigger than 5 people, right? And most families with 5 people don't have written policies and procedures in your home. You just don't. Like I often, when I do this live, I ask people, like, how many people in the audience, how many people do you have more, do you have 4 or more people in your family? People raise their hands. I said, do you have written policies in your home? And all the hands go down, right? Now, so I think there's a reason that the compliance, sort of the regulators and enforcement like to see written policies and procedures, because otherwise, how do they know, right? How do they know that you have policies and procedures? And so in those cases where I say, it may not make sense for you to have a written policy on anti-bribery and corruption, you can do something simple. You don't need to have a long and complicated, because all what you're doing in that case, you're documenting your common understanding among your 5 people to someone who might want to understand how you're doing it. And this other someone, it could be your vendor. So think about it as not just doing it for yourselves, right? But people you do business with. How do they know what is your commitment to anti-bribery and corruption? What is your expectation in terms of what they are supposed to do in doing business with you? Think about it as that communication. And that can be much simpler than a many page and addressing many, many different functions. So that's one difference I can point to. So I could do this for all the elements. I'll just go through a few. So your dedicated compliance officers or compliance resources. That, in a large company, again, 50,000 person company, I expect them to have someone who is at least one full-time person, because I think that's a big enough job for a full-time person. If you tell me you have a full-time compliance officer in a 5-person company, I would question what that person does all day, because there's just not so that expectation can be adjusted. And when I was at DOJ, I actually had a company that came in. They found some problems and they self-disclosed to DOJ. Now, this was actually not even a company. It was a small nonprofit organization with about 100 people. And they found some wrongdoing. And I think before they came to DOJ, they decided, we need to show the DOJ we have a full-time compliance officer. So that they hired a compliance officer from a very large company, a company of 100,000 people worldwide. Like, they got one of these compliance officers from the large company to come to their small nonprofit organization, where 80%, like 80 out of the 100 people are engineers. They actually have very little sort of bribery risk. So when they came in with this officer, I was the person at DOJ who was supposed to assess their program. And I went into the meeting thinking, what is this person doing all day? Because there can't be enough for her to do. And shortly, she didn't last very long in that company, because truly there wasn't enough to do. So that's a perfect example of how you should not just take one concept from one and directly apply it to the other. In terms of just even monitoring, right? So again, I had faced a company that I was asking them how are you reviewing your payments against invoices? Because that's a significant control point. This is part of the monitoring and control. So who is reviewing your invoices to make sure all the payments are appropriate? And in this company, but the first question I asked them was, how many invoices do you have a month? This is a small company. And they said they have on average, about 50 invoices that they have to pay out a month. Now, that's a very different scenario than a company that has 5,000 invoices a day, right? So with 50 invoices a month, so I said, well, who's reviewing them? So this person sitting at the meeting at DOJ across the table from me said, oh, it's me or her. So if one of us is on vacation, the other is covering. Well, I said, that's fine. That makes sense. That sounds like it should be enough given the number of invoices that you have. Now, if they had 5,000 invoices a month, I'd definitely say that's not enough. So that goes back to all that risk assessment aspect that we're talking about, is what is the volume you're looking at? What is your risk? The risk factor influences the risk factor and your company profile. Your company profile is part of that risk assessment. So what kind of business is your company in? Who are your customers? What kind of market are you doing business in? Is this a market or a sector with a lot of corruption risks? If you are a bakery company that sell cakes and bread to consumers in a shop on the street, I'd say your bribery and corruption risk is relatively low. I can only think of one particular area, which is licensing and permitting, right? So you need government license and permits to run a bakery shop, and that might be a point. And that's a relatively discrete risk exposure. Whereas if you're a bakery shop that sells to government military bases to supply their restaurant, your risk profile is different. So this is when you have to think about, what kind of business am I in? What are the government contacts we have? Who are our customers? Who are our competitors? And you think about those and you adjust your elements of the compliance program according to your business profile and according to the risk exposure that you have. Now, we can go into this. I can easily talk about this, and we can all collectively talk about this for the next hour, but I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much, Hui. I think this is super helpful. I love the emphasis that you put on risk assessment and showed through real life examples how that risk assessment is going to affect the other elements of the compliance program, which I think is really key to keep in mind. I want to turn now to Cristine. Cristine, continuando a conversa contigo, ao avaliar o programa de integridade de uma pequena ou média empresa, ou aconselhar uma empresa sobre como implementar aquele programa, quais são os elementos mais importantes do ponto de vista da CGU? A Hui mencionou uma série de elementos, políticas e procedimentos, por escrito, investigação interna, ter alguém na função, se for necessário fazer um reporte desse tipo de incidente. Então, são esses elementos, é alguma coisa diferente que pesa para a CGU? E no particular de uma pequena ou média empresa, o que realmente importa e faz a diferença?
Obrigada, Bernardo. Um pouco, ao mesmo tempo, positivo, muito bom falar após a Hui, mas ela já adiantou boa parte da minha fala. Estamos alinhados, assim, concordamos muito com vários requisitos e vários aspectos trazidos pela Hui. A CGU tem se debruçado em estudar a necessidade de adequação das medidas de integridade ou de requisitos de integridade para as micro e pequenas empresas. É importante a gente lembrar que, se por um lado o mesmo programa não é exigido ou necessariamente deve ser adequado a depender do tipo e da estrutura da empresa, é importante a gente lembrar que a integridade é um compromisso que independe do tamanho da empresa. Então, assim, a gente fala, o compromisso com a integridade independe do tamanho, do ramo de atuação, de quantidade de funcionários. Isso para dizer que é possível, sim, que qualquer empresa, independente da sua estrutura, venha assumir esse compromisso com a integridade, né? Venha a instituir medidas mínimas que são relevantes para evitar a prática de irregularidades e para trazer essa mensagem de compromisso com a integridade. Não necessariamente um super programa, uma grande estrutura ou com um grande investimento. E aí, novamente, falando do Pacto Brasil, foi um dos motivos também que a gente trouxe o Pacto Brasil, essa iniciativa, e ali no Pacto Brasil, quando a gente fala em medidas mínimas, a gente traz várias das medidas citadas e descritas aqui pela Ruei. A CGU hoje, quando ela faz a avaliação de um programa de integridade que tem relação com micro e pequenas empresas, nós temos um regulamento que é um pouquinho antigo, uma portaria conjunta que foi editada justamente com esse enfoque de adequação para as MPS, para as micro e pequenas empresas. Mas é importante eu frisar que esse regulamento está sendo revisado justamente para rediscutir, porque vários aspectos, outros aspectos foram trazidos desde então, mas dentro dessa portaria que hoje ainda permanece como uma referência, cotejada com o decreto regulamentador da lei anticorrupção também, mas sim, a gente fala da importância da avaliação de riscos, da importância de cada empresa, pelo tamanho que ela possui, ou pelo risco, pela área de atuação, que ela faça essa análise de risco, em relação a qual ela está exposta, e com base nisso ela vai definir quais seriam aquelas medidas que ela precisa implementar em relação ao seu programa de integridade. E, de uma forma geral, a gente sempre traz a questão do comprometimento da alta direção da empresa, do apoio que seja uma empresa de 5 pessoas, mas o chefe máximo, ele vem e assume o seu compromisso, ele vem e, de forma reiterada, ele diz sobre a importância, ele tenta esclarecer o grupo, ele tenta esclarecer os seus fornecedores, os seus clientes, quanto à importância de uma conduta ética, de conduta transparente. Então, aí a gente fala também da instituição de um código de ética, de um código de conduta, da definição de políticas, inclusive em relação a procedimentos que vedem expressamente a concessão de vantagens econômicas a agentes públicos. Às vezes, o óbvio precisa ser dito também, né? Então, dando alguns exemplos, a questão de treinamentos, da importância de que o grupo ali daquela empresa esteja sempre sendo treinado, sempre seja relembrado de adotar procedimentos padrões, de adotar procedimentos transparentes, procedimentos que atuem de forma ética, disponibilizar um canal, uma forma para que todo aquele grupo de funcionários possa fazer algum tipo de denúncia, algum tipo de reclamação. Então, disponibilizar de uma forma acessível para todos, né? E aí a gente fala também algo importante, que a Wei também citou, para as empresas que precisam de regulamentação ou de licenças específicas dentro do seu setor de atuação, que tem uma preocupação em relação àquela licença, de estar sempre atuando de forma tempestiva na renovação de licença e quaisquer outros tipos de requisitos que existam. E, novamente, a questão da análise de riscos, ela veio também prevista nas medidas mínimas do Pacto Brasil, como uma indução e novamente de despertar para a importância da realização da análise de riscos, porque com base nessa análise, nessa avaliação de riscos, é que a empresa vai, de fato, conhecer quais são as medidas, qual é o mecanismo de prevenção que ela deve adotar para evitar a ocorrência de corrupção. Falando muito em linhas gerais, Bernardo, até porque a UEI também trouxe muitas contribuições, e relembrando que a CGU vem estudando esse tema, estamos em revisão da nossa regulamentação, e com isso, inclusive, estamos alinhando discussões e parcerias com o SEBRAE. Para quem não conhece, o SEBRAE é uma instituição no Brasil, uma instituição que todas as micro e pequenas empresas possuem acesso, e ela promove cursos, promove treinamentos, orientações técnicas para esse grupo empresarial. Então, a CGU, em parceria com o SEBRAE, essa instituição, vem estudando e desenvolvendo pesquisas para regulamentar e abarcar esse grupo de empresas que é tão importante para o nosso país.
Maravilha, muito obrigado, Cristine. Que ótimo que vocês estão, tu e a Rui estão alinhadas, é um sinal que a CGU está aí atuando com as melhores práticas, e super interessante a iniciativa de buscar, por meio de instituições como o SEBRAE, essa visão do setor privado antes de instituir reformas e trabalhar em normativas, né? Eu acho que isso é super saudável. O chat aqui da nossa conversa tem várias perguntas super interessantes. Eu já estou conseguindo, eu acho, colocar algumas dessas perguntas como elementos das perguntas que eu estou colocando. But now I want to continue the conversation with Maria. Maria, I want to ask you about the Office of Institutional Integrity's assessment in the context of IDB Invest projects. Let's say that your team is assessing the integrity risks in connection with a potential project with a small or a medium enterprise. And the project team is trying to decide whether or not to go forward with the transaction. Or we have already invested, right? The project is already in our portfolio and we identify corruption risks. When you're assessing a company's compliance program, where do you focus, given all these elements that Hui and Cristine mentioned? And perhaps a follow-up question on that would be, going forward, what are some of the novel ways in which the IDB group is thinking of supporting the small and medium-sized companies in the region when it comes to compliance programs?
Thank you, Bernardo. Such a good question, and I'm going to try to divide it into three pieces. One, it's what do we do when we are engaging during the due diligence. The due diligence, which is prior a financing project, one of the key elements that Cristine and Hussein mentioned is know your customer. Part of the know your customer includes evaluating the company if the company has faced any is facing current or past penalties related to any serious ethical or financial misconduct. For us, it's critical to understand how the companies manage these risk indicators. This involves if the company has, this involves for us assessing the company's response to these risks. If the industry presents inherent risks, reviewing the ability of the company to respond effectively to the potential risk indicators during the due diligence, this is a key element that we are going to be evaluating. The assessment is fundamental for us to ensure the company commitment to ethical practices. And to give you some key elements of our review is whether the company has self-detected, whether the company has responded to the risk indicators by investigating, whether the policies of the companies were followed after a risk assessment. That's one of the elements that Chen was making it as crucial. It's because not one size fits all. So for us, it will be the ability of the company of reacting, or how it reacted, is going to be crucial to trust and move forward. When it goes to the portfolio, once we are already investing in, what we expect from our counterparties is for them to respond in the same way that they were able to show us in their policies and procedure or in the past actions. What I think that is important, maybe if I can share some real examples, some real life examples, is when initially a company that we were working with them, it showed us that did not have a compliance program. It was a small company that we didn't expect them to have it, so we went along, holding their hand to support them in implementing a compliance program. They hired a third party, an independent third party, and they implemented a compliance program. After some indicators occur, and the company proactively responded to those indicators. Over the time, this company recognized the value that the compliance program was bringing to their activities. Not only helped them to mitigate the risks that we identified and give us the trust that we need to continue investing in, but also attracted other investors. And that's something that for us was very valuable to hear from them, that this support that at the beginning could be perceived that it's an extra burden that we are asking to a new company to implement. Afterwards, the company come back and said, this approach that you guys promoted with us help us to receive further financing from third-party investors. That's one of the cases, but also things can go in the other side. A company show us that they have a strong, what it seems to have, a strong policies and procedures in place. But what happened next is that when we identified an indicator, the company did not react accordingly. And that's one of the risks that sometimes we can be facing, which is paper programs. So having a program in place is not enough. And I'm going to take what Christine was saying, is the tone that the company has, the ability of management on enforcing that policy and requesting the company to adhere to those practices that they show us at the beginning that they have. So we in supervision, what we will try to enforce is, you have these policies that we relied, now put it in place. Let's apply. And now what the last point of your question, that is what the IDB group is thinking for supporting SMEs. For me, it's a fascinating question, because we acknowledge that one of the most difficult challenge is that companies that have nothing in place yet, how we can help them to, or require them to adopt something, to enter into these compliance practices, which bring us to what we are calling an integrity compliance solution. OII, the office that I'm here representing, frequently recommends to companies to incorporate an anti-corruption compliance program when there is an integrity risk. The objective will be for companies to develop systems and capacity to manage integrity risks aligned with international best practices. Usually what this means is to hire a third party to help them to do the risk assessment, which is, as we were saying, all of us we were saying, is the key first step, and then all international best practices is to conduct a risk assessment, and then to design their controls. The way that we are supporting is to preparing, we are working on a self-assessment tool that will help the companies to conduct and analyze by themselves the risk presented by their operations. This work, what does is two important things. One, it will mitigate the risk for the IDB group, in the sense of the company starts speaking, now they are aware of the risk that they present, and manage the risk, promoting an overall integrity environment, and also improves the risk management along the companies. What it's, and I don't want to stay along this because I see the time is passing, but what we are trying to do with this effort is helping the companies to identify the risk, prepare their policies and procedures that are designed for the risks, but under a common standard, which is another part that is crucial, is having different standards in the different countries is something that we face sometimes. So we are trying to bring international best practices across the region. And I'm going to stop here, and then I can get more into the details, but thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Maria. Super interesting. it's unfortunate we don't have more time to keep the discussion going, but I wanted, if we have time, to ask one question that came up in the audience. Hui, you mentioned a risk assessment. Who does the risk assessment? Who should do it? You mentioned having a compliance person dedicated to this. It could be someone else. I think maybe we can have you address that question from the audience.
Just very quickly, who does it for the company? It really should be a joint exercise within. So this is an exercise where you take your financial information, your business model. So it really shouldn't be one person. It should be all the people, your finance person, your legal person, your whoever is performing those roles, and critically your business people, right? So I think for that risk assessment exercise in the company, it should be done by all the stakeholders that are involved.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are out of time. So I want to share on the screen here the QR code so you guys can all provide us with feedback on the session. And with that, sorry. Here's the QR code. And with that, I wanted to thank everyone so much for joining us on behalf of IDB Invest. It was a pleasure. This was really an amazing conversation. And we want to keep the conversation going. I hope you can enjoy the rest of the event. And for those of you that will be present in person in Manaus, I really hope you have a great time. Thank you so much for our dear panelists. Thank you so much for devoting your time and effort on this. It's truly, truly appreciated. Muito obrigado a todos, de verdade, e tenham todos uma ótima tarde.
Obrigada.
Obrigado, Bernardo.
Obrigada.
Hasta pronto.